What I would like to do is start with saying a few words about Jim as an individual and person here. So he was a model railroader's model railroader. The inspiration, help, and friendships he extended to others in the hobby is just too vast to chronicle. His HOn3 Glenwood and Black Creek narrow gauge railroad undoubtedly ranks as one of the two best known narrow gauge model railroads in the world. Jim said he drew inspiration from John Allen's game-changing H.O. Gory and Defeated Railroad, which he was privileged to visit on several occasions. John's influence on Jim is evident to anyone who had the pleasure of visiting his railroad. Jim was an author. He authored articles for Model Railroader, Railroad Model Craftsman, the HOn3 Annual, and the Narrow Gauge and Short Line Gazette. The May-June 1982 issue saw Jim's first article in the Gazette, and unbeknownst to all at the time, his last article ran in the November-December 2017 issue. That was 35 years of Gazette article authoring that added up to 174 articles for us narrow gauge model railroad fans. In addition to those articles, Jim also wrote an uncountable number of product reviews for the New and Review column in the Gazette. Jim was also a clinician. He presented clinics at MNRA national conventions, national narrow gauge conventions, PCR conventions, just about any kind of a convention that asked Jim to present, he was willing to do so. Layout tours, Jim was really generous. He opened up his railroad for tours at most of the conventions in the area. He would open it up if a visitor called up and said, "Can I come over and see your railroad?" Jim would say, "Sure, I can do that," and the arrangements would be made. Jim also hosted operating sessions. Anybody that reads his series in the Gazette knows that operation was a primary aim and goal of Jim's construction of the railroad. And Jim ended up hosting two types of sessions over the years. One session was informal with respect to dispatching, but it used his own home designed card system for creating work. The second type of session was operation under timetable and train orders with a fast clock dispatcher, a train lineup sheet for the day, and again, his card system being used for car movements. Jim also thought that fellowship was a real important part of the hobby, and he addressed that by always being available to offer advice if it asked. He had a definite opinions formed from his own practical experience, and he was humble even as he received numerous awards for his models and contributions to the hobby. Jim could bring practical knowledge to just about any model railroad topic, and this was based on his modeling experiences in HO, HOn3, ON3, and experience with live steam as a past employee of the Roaring Camp and Big Trees 3-foot gauge mountain climbing railroad in Felton, where he was in engine service, and also the construction and operation of a 3-foot gauge outside frame 280 in 1.5-inch scale. Jim liked building things and he was prolific. And as a result, in 2000, Jim was awarded the honor of Master Model Railroader by the National Model Railroad Association. And so with that, let's take a look and see what this creation was that Jim had put together over his lifetime. So when you went to Jim's house, the first thing that you would see upon coming to the front door was usually this sign down in the right-hand corner that says, "The door's open, Jim's playing trains in the basement." This is your invitation to just step into the foyer. We had a sign that pointed down a hallway, which you went down, that was lined with railroad art from the ceiling down to the floor. And then at the end of that hallway, if you turned right again, you saw a door that opened it down into the basement. So into the basement, as you went down a steep set of stairs, fortunately there was a handrail there because you needed it to hang on to while you enjoyed all of the railroad artifacts and art that Jim had decorated the descent into the basement with. And at the end of the stairs, you turned right and there was a landing with another 2 steps down. And what you saw in front of you was the end of one of Jim's peninsulas on the railroad that had the sign "End of Standard Gauge" that was copied from the sign that was outside of Antonito, Colorado. Once in the room, if you look to your right, this is what you saw, just an overwhelming amount of railroad detail and scenery. But first, let's take a look at what the railroad was in the basement. So Jim's room, the main room size was 16 foot 6 inches by 35 foot 0 inches. Over time, Jim basically took out a bathroom that was down there. I don't know what the size of that was, but it basically provided him with more layout room. He also took over a hallway, and then he moved into an unfinished basement that doesn't show in these two diagrams. What we're looking at here are the track plan that Jim had provided for the Narrow Gauge and Short Line Gazette, the May-June 1997 issue. And I have modified these diagrams, and the larger text that you see on here are all of the extensions that Jim built onto the railroad since he had this particular article published in 1997. So Jim didn't quit when he had this done; he just kept going. So this is a picture again of more close-up of what we saw in the first photo of the layout, and this is the section of the railroad that's basically represented by the rectangle around the track diagram that's in the lower right-hand corner of this slide. And what we have here is the bottom level, the desk. Well, that was the dispatcher's desk. It also contained a Rolodex with I don't know how many thousands of phone numbers and things of all Jim's model railroad friends around the world. Up above that is I'm going to say it's a residential scene with a small commercial area appended to it that Jim just had a lot of kits to build these and he wanted to build them. And so he said, I think I'm going to need this scene. This particular scene, he basically grafted onto a small standard gauge yard for his Central California Coast Railroad. And that kind of made a pretty neat scene. You had residential in the foreground, he had trains, and then in the background, as you can see, he had a whole lot of flats with an awful lot of industries that he'd named after his friends. Up above that is another part of the railroad that was just grafted on, and that is the Homestake or the Holmes Lime Company. And Jim decided he needed more than that one industry down there. So he decided this was a great place to put an oil refinery. After all, there was oil in the Santa Cruz Mountains in the early years. And so Jim found an article on building a really ancient oil refinery and model railroader, and he used that article to scratch build the refinery you see here. At the far end of the limestone scene is you'll see a shadow box, and that shadow box and that whole scene in there was basically built in a prior residence and was moved lock, stock, and barrel over to Jim's new house and built into this railroad. That contained the town of Henning, and a little bit more about that later. Up above Henning, you can see a kind of a mustard-colored building, and that's the start of Jack's Cabin. That particular building was from Boone Morrison's railroad. So when Boone got out of HOn3, Jim acquired this building from him and built it into his railroad. Up above the Homestake scene we're looking at part of Placerville, and again we're going to be showing that here in the next slide. So we're at the end of that peninsula now, looking back over Placerville. Placerville, you can see a main line swinging around in the front near the depot, and you can see a siding, which is the outside track there. And down below is a spur off the track that led down to the oil refinery and the Holmes Lime Company. In the background, just about in the center of the photo, is a place called Zaka Junction. It was a turnout in the middle of nowhere, just off of a bridge that you see to the right. And at that was the junction where the line split and could continue down through Placerville and on through the rest of the main line of the railroad to staging. Or the line could split going up through Jack's Cabin to Crested, Butte. To the right of Zaka is what's known as the High Line that ran down Fall River Canyon. And that basically was part of the main line, and it went to Winter Park and then then on to Coombers and finally to downhill to the end of the line as Jim had modeled this. In another picture of Placerville, you can see all the cars and things in the photograph here. Jim was a real automobile fanatic. In fact, he was a hot rodder. He had a hot rodded pickup truck. He had a Camaro. He had an old Chevy Roadster that was turned into a hot rod. And Jim and Eric Bracker would jointly hit various car meets and things of this sort and go to car rallies around California. And they had a lot of fun doing that. But at any rate, Jim, there wasn't an automobile he wouldn't build and put on the layout if he could get the kit. This again is still on that same peninsula, and this is after you're leaving Placerville, is you basically go into what was known as the Long Ravine. And the picture on the left shows the Long Ravine trestle. And that's what moved you out of Placerville on around behind scenery that ran down to another portion of the layout. Understanding Jim's railroad, it took you a number of trips there to run trains before you finally had it figured out if something went in here where it was going to come out later. The middle scene at the top is again more of that same scene there. Um, and Jim built this scene because he really wanted to have more mining industry in this area to provide some more switching operations. So this became the Gold Hill Mining District. And then in the bottom right, as you can see, a little bit more of that same Gold Hill Mining District. The gray ballast track at the bottom of that photo is the Central California Coast Standard Gauge Railroad. So we're back to the two upper and lower levels of the railroad, and what the portion in boxes is what we're going to look at next, and that's going to be Fall River Canyon. So this is two photos of Fall River Canyon taken from opposite ends of the canyon. The photo on the left and in the left rear of the photos is you can see the remains of the Gold Hill Mining District, and you can also see barely Zaka Junction on that upper level. So that's the high line coming out across here. Down the cliffs is the standard gauge main line, and down below that is the narrow gauge line that ended up running to Forks Creek. The picture on the right is the view of that taken again from the opposite end of the view on the left. And again, we can see on the upper level there, the HOn3 main line of the Glenwood and Black Creek running down through a snow shed and then popping out into Winter Park, which was permanent snow territory on Jim's railroad. You can see the standard gauge running down the center and disappearing into a tunnel. And on the bottom, we can see a couple of bridges carrying the HOn3 line to Forks Creek, which is at the end there. The bridge in the foreground is a lenticular truss. Jim found that particular design in an engineering book on bridges. Not sure if a railroad ever built one, but Jim decided he was going to build one for his railroad. So he sat down, used the engineering text for that thing, designed this bridge, and then scratch built it. The other bridge on the lower level was a more conventional through truss design bridge. At Forks Creek, the railroad again split. One of the forks at Forks Creek basically went on to staging, which was Blackhawk, and the other fork took you to Rico. Again, we're going to come back to the diagram in order to highlight where we're going to be looking next. We're going to be looking next at both sides of the first peninsula in the room. So this is the backside of that first peninsula in the room. The interesting thing about this is down at the far end, there's a door to the exterior of the house. Jim decided he needed more railroad than he needed the door to the exterior. There were several other exits by which you could get out. So what he did, he basically built, again, on the upper level, you can see a shadow box. And again, this came over without anything in it from his previous residence. And so here he decided he was going to build a town called Telluride. Then he thought, well, okay, if he had Telluride in there, he could probably exit through the end of the Telluride shadow box, build a trestle out across the door after he'd basically enclosed that in, put a real narrow shelf that was only somewhere around 6 to 8 inches wide that you see on the upper level there, and run a single line and put in a spur here coming down through Eagle Creek again, which had a mine clinging to a hillside there. And then from there, he could get into Crested Butte, which was another expansion into a hallway. So down below Telluride is Patron. Patron used to be just a single mainline track, and then a switch that basically went off to a sneak track that went around behind Henning and then came back in, forming a reverse loop. Well, Jim decided he actually needed a passing siding here and a little bit of an industry, so he basically bumped the layout again. So every expansion that Jim did on the railroad basically ate up aisle space. So passing people in there was hard to do, and sometimes somebody had to back out of an aisleway in order to let somebody by and then re-enter. But that was Patron there, and it was an important place on the railroad. Jim then decided he needed to build a branch to a town called Felton, which is an actual place in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And so he decided the best way to do that was to put in in another turnout at the far end of Patron, put in a dam to hold back a river he had there, bring a short trestle across in the foreground, and then build another really shallow shelf that you can see on the lower left running across the wall there. And this is what basically got you to a lift out bridge and across the lift out into Felton. The other side of that peninsula we were looking at was the largest, I'm going to say, pile people purpose on the railroad. This again is where Jim had his workbench, and he basically built all of these things to fit in. Those drawers are just loaded with kits, parts, pieces, and everything else, as were another bookshelf and a few other things he had down below the bench work on here. Well, that's Jim on the left, and he's talking to Dave Grant and Steve Anderson on the right, two of the Glenwood and Black Creek operating crew. The workbench basically serves as a coffee and donut station during operating sessions, and so that's what we were doing the day this photograph was taken. So up above the coffee station there is part of the railroad, and that is the big bottom loop that got you around into Patron. So coming out of Patron is you went through the town of Logan, and Logan basically was the site of the granite rock quarry. And this was part of the railroad that Jim based on actually the prototype granite rock quarry that was again in the Santa Cruz area. So Jim basically had a lot of photographs on that and scaled it down and built as much of it and fit it into this scene as he could. To the right of the rock quarry and everything is another place called Clyde. Clyde ended up being an engine facility and car repair facility on Jim's railroad. So this engine facility was located about halfway down the main line, and its purpose was to provide helpers for getting trains up out of Rico and up out of Black Hawk. So again, this was putting kind of a helper station at the top of the steep portion of that climb, and then dispatching light engines down there to pull things back up. Up above that is you can see on the right behind Steve's head and Dave's head, that's Jack's cabin, and it came out on a narrow shelf, crossed that, and then swung around the big loop up there to get to the Telluride shadow box scene. And where you see the water tank and things, Jim had a real neat country store and street scene there, and he named that Wilder. Again, another place in the Santa Cruz Mountains. So now we're actually headed to the third peninsula, as you can see down there. And this is one of the signature scenes on Jim's railroad. This is the lumber mill on the West Side Railroad at Tuolumne, California. And Jim just was a real West Side fan. And so he basically thought he needed to do this because he liked logging and all of the clutter and everything that went with it. This is another picture of the same mill from the other end. And it was a marvelously built and weathered structure. This existed as a foam core mock-up for, I don't know, 15, 20 years before Jim finally decided he really needed to finish the scene and everything else, and he did. And it took him around 6 months to get it into this shape. Another, just a comment on this. This particular scene is basically enshrined now in the California State Railroad Museum in a MNRA display there called The Magic of Scale Model Railroading on one of the upper levels. And that's, if you ever get out to that museum, it's certainly worth a trip to see the museum itself and visit this particular exhibit. So on the back side of the hill that Jim modeled behind the West Side Mill, Jim basically modeled a place called Saw Pit after after a place. Well, actually, it wasn't Saw Pit. I got that wrong. That's Soap Creek, and that was after a place that actually was on the West Side Railroad. Jim didn't worry about what was actually there, as Jim wanted to build an equipment repair facility, a log reload spot, and so he did. And as you can see, this is just typical of Jim's eye for detail and in particular clutter. Running up behind this scene, you can see a water flume here, and that was used as a break and to hide from the typical viewing distance, part of the main line that was running up behind that flume and then disappeared through some trees to emerge on another part of the railroad. Down below that West Side and Soap Creek scene was the major visible terminal on the Glenwood and Black Creek. What we're looking at is we're looking at East Yard, which is located in Black Creek, actually, on this. And this was marvelous. You can see Black Creek in the background, and Black Creek was actually a thriving metropolis with brick buildings and a nightclub and a bunch of other things going on. This is a picture of the engine facilities at Black Creek, or at least the roundhouse. The engine facilities were there, and that included a sand house and a coaling tower and an ash pit and several ready tracks. And Jim used the ready tracks to pre-stage locomotives for an operating session. And the reason he did that is the aisle the individual is standing in that took this photograph is so small and so tight, you could only get one person in there at a time. And usually that aisle was needed by somebody operating the peddler freight down at Rico. And so trying to get people in and out, it was just too much of a bother. So Jim decided, if I pre-stage the locomotives, they can pick them up from the other side of the aisle, and you won't have to get in there in order to use the indexing turntable. This is another picture. This is the root of that peninsula, both the upper and lower levels. Upper level again is Soap Creek and the reload. The bottom again is Black Creek and on into Glenwood staging. Up behind Soap Creek, as you can see, Coombers way in the background with the airplane flying overhead. This is a photo of the depot at Black Creek, and this was scratch built based on the depot that was the Southern Pacific Depot at Santa Cruz. And Jim spent a lot of time as a youth growing up in Santa Cruz and spending as much time as he could down at the railroad station and the yards and the engine house that used to be there. And so it took him quite a while to get this structure built. And the space was previously held down by a model of the depot at Rico, but he decided he really wanted Santa Cruz Depot in there. So we built this over about a period of a year. These two photos were taken by Jim himself, and they basically show winter scenes up at Winter Park. Jim used these to send out Christmas greetings and things of this sort when he said, I think I need to send out a Christmas card this year. To the left, in both these scenes, is the High Line, and to the right you can see twin tunnel portal. There was both a siding and the main line went through there, and those tunnel portals basically emptied those two tracks out into Coombers to the right. So this is looking at Coombers. There's the two tunnel portals. We've left the snow part of the railroad and we're back into I guess sunny California, because that's really what this scenery is up here. And so these are several views at Coombers. Jim built most of the buildings that were up at Coombers and had those populated in there. He also wanted to provide switching activity. So Jim put up a number of industry spurs and things of this sort, and buildings and stock pens as well to generate traffic. This picture here is Rico. Rico is located down below Coombers, and this scene beneath it has part of the narrow gauge staging yards and part of the standard gauge trackage and everything else. So this entire scene was built that it could be pulled out piece by piece, including the scenery, in order to get to a real problem should one occur. And yep, we've watched Jim carefully remove this thing once or twice over the years in order to get to a really big problem that occurred down below. The other thing is Rico was the turnaround point for a local train. And if you got the Rico turn out of Black Creek, you basically had a job that was going to take you all day. You would run that one train for the entire session to get you from Black Hawk to Rico, do the work, some of the work on the way back, and finally tie up from where you originated. So Jim got between the two levels with a helix, and the helix was built into one corner of the room. And Jim was concerned about operators losing sight of the train and keep turning up the throttle or whatever it is until it came roaring out of a tunnel at jackrabbit speed. So he decided he was going to take the middle part of the helix and he was going to herniate it and bring it out into where it would be visible. So the operator would be able to see his train, as it traversed at least part of the helix here. So in order to add interest, as Jim created a water stop on the herniated part of the helix called Mountain Charlie, which again was a named place in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and built in that hillside water stop that you see there. The right-hand photo shows that piece of narrow gauge exiting a tunnel, crossing a trestle on its way to the water stop on the left. Right below the narrow gauge exiting, that you can see two narrow gauge tracks converging in a turnout and disappearing into the mountain. And that was a really short siding at a place called Vail that was big enough for a couple of helper locomotives, which was really a good deal in trying to get light helpers back down from Coombers down to Black Creek. And coming out of that concrete tunnel portal on the bottom is the standard gauge main line and a passing siding. In order to further alleviate operators' fears of where's my train, he basically had a video camera inside the helix that gave you a view of both the staging yards and the helix itself. And down in the right-hand corner, not visible, hung a monitor, so you could look down there and you could follow the progress of your train in or out of staging, or around the helix if you were moving between one tech and the other. So now we're moving on to a location of unknown side that was previously a bathroom till Jim decided people could go up and downstairs to use the bathroom. And once he had decided that and said, I'm going to put railroad in there, that freed him up to get really creative. So in this bathroom, he included the coke ovens, the Ophir Loop, a West Side scene, and an El Viso dock scene. And so what we're looking at is you came out of Black Creek for a run over the railroad. Is you basically entered the bathroom, went across Bridge 45A at Ophir, swung around Ophir, and then out of Ophir climbed up to coke ovens. Um, at coke ovens, you again ducked back into the other room, and you came out on a viaduct, and that viaduct basically crossed high above uh, Black Black Creek, and it wove through tall buildings and things of this sort. It was again something straight out of John Allen. This is what else was in that bathroom. Jim extended the logging line out of town, and he ended up deciding he wanted to build a model of River Bridge off of the west side, which he did. And at the far end of the photo in the upper left, it just basically stubs into the backdrop. And to the left, not seen, is he modeled a spur at Baker. Baker was a place not too far out of Tuolumne itself that really was a couple of sightings for storage of equipment and things of this sort. So Jim got in one of the buildings there and part of the sighting. Again, during operating sessions, this part of the railroad never operated. In the lower right-hand corner, this is El Viso Docks, and this railroad did operate. And interestingly enough, it was DC all the way. Jim never did convert it to DC and left it, or DCC, and left it as a DC operating portion of the layout. And that was simply because he had a small Mishkel #2 Shea that just ran like a watch, and he decided he he liked that more than trying to figure out how to get a decoder into something that small. So he left that DC, and cars were interchanged between the El Viso Docks guy and the guy running the East Yard through through again another tunnel out of Black Creek that passed cars below the tracks above that were running through coke ovens. So now we're going to jump to another part of the railroad that really wasn't shown in the diagrams, and this is going to be the Crested Butte branch. The two rectangles that you see on the "Where Are We" locator shows the wide one, that being Crested Butte itself, and the narrow one is a narrow shelf that basically contained the depot and a leg of a really long Y. In the middle of the Y, Jim located a engine facility based on the CNS engine facility, I believe, in Como, and he had a turntable in there. And this is where all the Colorado and Southern motive power and equipment hung out. In the days of DC, CNS stuff was run in operating sessions and as part of the layout. Jim never did get around to converting the CNS equipment to DCC, so this became pretty much scenery. But the rest of Crested Butte, even though it started life as a staging yard, was turned into an operating yard, and we originated a couple of trains and a peddler freight out of there each session. That move was made when Jim decided he needed more staging. And in the bottom right photo is what we're looking at is the yard at Crested Butte. And if you look down at the end, you can see a dark hole in that building to the right. And that dark hole was a track that led through to more staging in an unfinished part of the basement that was never going to have railroad in it. And we'll look at that a little bit later. So down below Crested Butte was Felton, and this was the last part of the layout Jim was working on when he passed away. And this time he decided that rather than hand-painted backdrops, he was going to try and use photo murals, and he was doing that quite effectively, putting those up. So what you see on the left is a scratch-built engine house. On the right, you can see the turntable pit that served that engine house, and part of the small yard at Felton that was going to include a couple of industries and things. And again, at the far end and not really visible, there was another hole in the wall that went back to more staging in the other room. The lower right shows the lift out that I mentioned when we were talking about the thin tracks along one of the walls in in one of Jim's aisleways. This was the lift out. It was a piece of furniture grade plywood, and Jim held that in place with 4 super magnets pairs on either end of it. And when that bridge was in place, it was not going to move. It was just plain rock solid. Um, in fact, getting it out to hang it up so you could get down the aisle there was sometimes a problem, but it seemed to work well. You can see at the far end of the bottom right picture a doorway. This doorway was maybe 18 to 20 inches tall, and it was probably less than 5 feet tall. And the reason for that is you're looking at the floor there, but that's really a raised platform that's 18 inches off the basement floor. And that platform continued through that door and out into the other room into staging. So this is what Jim had for staging. I said he was a prolific car builder, and it turns out Jim was also a record keeper. So at this point, I'll go ahead and mention that he had 749 pieces of rolling stock in or around this railroad. He had 183 locomotives in or around this narrow gauge, both standard gauge and narrow gauge locomotives. And not all of them were completed. A number of them were still, if you will, brass in box, waiting for Jim to get around to work on them. So coming in from the Crested Butte and from Boulder Creek or Felton, what we have here are, again, Jim was building shadow boxes because he could build those in sections and expand this thing as he needed. The other thing he did is he basically built in drop-down covers just simply because this was a completely unfinished part of the layout with a lot of dust and dirt and things of this sort. And that would keep this stuff reasonably clean while it was sitting in staging. So Jim had built the first shadow box on each, and then he got to the point where that wasn't enough. So then a couple of more shadow boxes were built down the length. Then they ran into another cinder block wall down there. So Jim decided he could build a corner module and swing a track around that corner and then build another couple of shadow boxes, which you see extending off to the right in the right hand photo. At that point, in order to get in and around yet another part of the basement that had the furnace and everything else in it, Jim had kind of reached really the end of the line on being able to expand staging at this point. So with that, let's take a look at how Jim's railroad looked in a more linear fashion. So to the west was Glenwood, which was staging, and you came out of Glenwood and you went immediately into Black Creek, and from Black Creek you could get to El Viso, or the main line extended through Ophir, then Coke Ovens, then up over the viaduct over Black Creek to Verily, then into the Helix and on to Mountain Charlie, then from Mountain Charlie in through Tuolumne, which is where that west side mill was, and around backside of that was Ralph, which branched off to Soap Creek, Baker, Flume, River Bridge, and Camp 13, according to the scheme of things. Or if you kept on the main line at Ralph, you went up to Coombers, and from Coombers to Winter Park, and from Winter Park across the High Line to Zaka. And at Zaka, if you took the Crested Butte branch, you ended up in Crested Butte. If you didn't, you continued on the main line. You went around through Placerville, crossed Long Ravine, circled behind the town of Heading, behind the backdrop, ended up in Patron, and then came out in Logan and Clyde. And then again, out of those shadow boxes, into the shadow box of Henning, out of there to the Gold Hill Mining District. And then from down there, you disappeared, made another loop, and came down the long ravine to Forks Creek. And at Forks Creek, you could stay on the main line and go to the staging, which was Black Hawk, or you could go to Rico. In reality, Glenwood and Black Hawk were one and the same staging yard, and you could get to either one of those from there, and he could also reverse trains from either one of those yards using that track complex that Jim had built in the staging yard. And during shows and things, Jim could use that as a continuous run connection, so that allowed him to basically put a couple of trains in orbit, if you will, and talk to visitors rather than have to worry about running trains. The other thing is with all the expansions and everything else, at some point, Jim decided, well, it was big to start with, and it's bigger now with all the additions. And so Jim sat down and made up a number of billboards for this railroad in order to advertise all the advances to the I'm going to say literally hundreds of people that populated his railroad. So you can see billboards with this artwork on it at various places around the railroad. I'm going to speak a little bit about Jim's car card system because it was unique. Those of you that followed any of Jim's articles know that Jim really liked to heavily weather things, including his rolling stock. So in a lot of cases, his reading reporting marks was almost impossible. So Jim said, well, we're going to solve that problem because we aren't going to use reporting marks to identify which car is supposed to be switched. We're just going to identify cars by the type of a car it was or is. So he basically made up pairs of cards in order to run his railroad. So you can see on the left a card called 7501A and 7501B. And the first card said, well, the move is going to be a set out, and it's going to be using a ventilated boxcar, and it's empty, and it's going to go from East Yard, and it's going to go to the Holmes Lime Company main warehouse. And so what this would tell the individual making up a train to switch Placerville and everything, he basically looked around East Yard when he found a ventilated boxcar, anybody's ventilated boxcar, he could grab the easiest one to get and put it in the train. Similarly, to get the car back home or to somewhere else, as the card B did that. If the car had been spotted there, there was a pickup card there for the next session that basically would say, okay, pick up what? A ventilated boxcar. Where? It's loaded with lime barrels now, and it's at the Holmes Lime Company main warehouse, and it's going to go on a train back to East Yard. Another interesting part about the car card system is Jim liked putting loads in his cars. So when we were operating the train or the railroad, it didn't make any difference whether there was a loader in the car or not. What that car was is whatever the car card said it was. So even though it may have had a load in it, if the car card said it was empty, that was okay. You could still grab that card, call it an empty, and send it on its way. And you can see another pair of similar cars there. If Jim wanted to have a car stop at several places on the railroad before it got back to the yard or somewhere else, he would just simply make a card C, D, E, F, etc. on that, and away he went. It was a pretty simple system, and most of us could figure out how to use it after a while. This is a look at the timetable out of the GNBC employee timetable number 5. And what this shows is Jim had to have a number of trains scheduled to run on the time clock, and they were both first and second class trains in here. Jim's sense of humor kind of showed up on this because if you look at trains number 1 and trains number 2, both of which are first class, you will find out that unlike most of everything else on the schedule these did not run every day. They sort of alternate days. So if you were at an operating session at Jim's, you had to know actually which day of the week you were there, so you would know which train you needed to look out for, which train that you would be running if you got called for one of those. And one of the things Jim enjoyed doing was finding somebody sitting in a siding waiting for a train that was never going to come, and then asking them what are you waiting for, and then suggesting they check the employee's timetable to see if that train they were waiting for was actually supposed to run that day. So that was just one of the things there, and a number of us fell into that trap over the years. So this is a look at the center columns of the dispatcher sheet for the Glenwood and Black Creek. And this basically just shows Jim was fearless when it came to repurposing and reusing things. And then on the column on the left, as you can see, he had that all the way down to the West Side Lumber Company branch, because at one time he thought he would plan on running that in operating sessions, which he never did. You can see that same column on the right and modified a little bit, but you no longer find the West Side Lumber branch. But what you do find is the Boulder Creek branch that basically went down to Boulder Creek and then on to Doherty Lumber. So this is what Jim had planned there, and it looks like you can see that on the day this we were running the railroad that way, is there wasn't anything that ran down the Boulder Creek branch, because those boxes were all crossed out. So again, taking a look at this is what Jim's original plan was, and as you can see from the presentation, he decided he needed to keep building, and he did. So let's take a look at a couple of things that weren't featured so much. This is the El Viso docks scene in here. The sketch that's upside down, that was from an article that Jim did in the Gazette on what was the El Viso docks area. And it turns out this is what it was. It was a really tiny compact switching yard, and included a switchback in there, a tiny runaround on that. But scenically, the interesting things about it is Jim incorporated 2 mirrors in this scene in order to make it look larger when you were standing in the viewer operating space. And this is what one portion of it looked like, where the docks were. The warehouse on the Monterey Bay Redwood Company dock there was actually 2-sided. The back side of it was lettered in reverse, painted a different color, and that's what you see right behind the Monterey Bay Redwood Company. That's the back side of that same building in the mirror as a reflection. And Jim had enough other things in there going that you really couldn't see yourself in the mirror. But it was really effective in expanding, making this waterfront scene look much larger than it did. And he did the same thing with the with the spur, or the tail of that runaround down there. He had a mirror in there, and with where he had positioned buildings, it just looked like the railroad was going down a canyon of waterfront industrial buildings. So this is a look at the expansions to Crested, Butte, and over to Felton. So in the upper right corner, basically, is Jim's sketch on how we got the things going there. You can see the Henning module above the workbench, the Logan Clyde module above the workbench, and how we fished the main line through there and out around the loop. And that main line on the bottom loop went to Logan. You can see he's got labeled branch line up above the Henning module, and that was that location turned out to be Jack's cabin. And again, you can see it went out and swung around that big loop and then into the Telluride box at that point. And that's where he decided he could close off the door, swing a loop out of the end of the Telluride box, and come down that far wall that we saw earlier. And then where it says branch line, that's just about where it split into the Y that was right outside of Crested, Butte. Again, you can see how all that worked in the larger track diagram over on the left here. What Jim had done at this time was start to build staging out the other end of the scene. And in the center is a clip that basically shows the track arrangement that he had in Telluride. And again, he had a switchback in there that had a really short tail on it. And again, if you had switching there and you had to get things in and out of any of those spurs down there, that took a long time to do. And you were always having to clear out for scheduled trains that were running through there out of staging at Floresa up behind Crested, Butte. So finally, let's take a look at the standard gauge. And the standard gauge is illustrated here. You can see that he had a hidden standard gauge staging down below Placerville. He also had a sneak track that went off and formed a reverse loop, so Jim could reverse entire standard gauge trains and run them in the opposite direction when he thought he needed to even up flange wear, I guess. What is not shown on this diagram is the passing track that started just right after that, coming off that bridge over Wright's Tunnel and came around and then tied back into the hidden staging a little further on up. But when we were taking down the layout, we discovered the answer to why Jim didn't run the complete selection of standard gauge trains that he ran in early years. And it turns out that when he was working on the scenery at the Gold Hill Mining District, is he basically put in a whole lot of plaster. And as we went through layers of that, we could see the different contours and things that Jim worked on until we got down to the lowest level, which really didn't get scenery on it. It was just hard shell. It turns out that hard shell dipped down such that it did not obscure the main line of the standard gauge track, but it did block passage of trains on the reverse loop track, and it prevented trains from getting in and out of staging. And so that was why in the later years is we only saw certain types of standard gauge trains always moving in the same direction on the standard gauge line, because Jim's scenery building it inadvertently sealed off the rest of the standard gauge equipment from the railroad. Something he never confessed to when he was alive. So looking at the standard gauges, you can on the left, this is near Forks Creek. You can see Forks Creek and the narrow gauge on the right hand side of that picture on the left, and you can see the standard gauge guy entering the tunnel that basically got you into a corner that was hidden. That standard gauge came out at the far end of Rico. And you can see that in the right-hand picture. It basically crossed a bridge, and you can see the turnout there that basically expanded into a passing siding before it disappeared into the big turn back loop that we were looking before. That was part of this whole staging and helix complex in the corner. And that's pretty much it for a tour of Jim's railroad. If you're interested in seeing more of the scenes from his railroad and some trains moving, check out a video made by John Abeticola of TSG Multimedia. John's got a web or a YouTube channel called TSG Multimedia. You can look that up. And there, if you search on layouts and things of this sort, you're going to be able to find Jim Bales, Glenwood and Black Creek narrow gauge Model Railroad HOn3 DCC layout tour. At the time that we did that, as John was concerned about advertising those layouts that were DCC. So that's the title of the tour.